So whenever you make not just a super successful film, but start an entire new franchise that Paramount can milk for the next decade, you get to make whatever the hell you want. And John Krasinski decided, in his own words, that he wanted to make a live-action Pixar film. That's the line that's been used in all of the marketing, it's the one that's been used in every review, and it's really interesting hearing that after it was just announced that Pixar are going to be doubling down on sequels, so not even Pixar can get Pixar films made anymore. But even with their recent output aside, everyone knows what that means. They're high-quality, innovative films that are aimed at kids but loved by everyone. And it seems to be that's the target that John Krasinski was aiming for, and it's one I don't think he hit. So I'm going to try break down the film by comparing it to Pixar's Best and see why If didn't quite hit the mark. So the film follows a young girl named Bee, and after a montage where we discover her mum has died of a terminal illness, a slightly older Bee is now faced with the fact that her dad, played by John Krasinski, is facing a potentially life-threatening illness as well. So Bee has to go live with her grandmother, but when she's in the apartment, she discovers a whole bunch of imaginary friends, or ifs, that are living there, and she goes on a journey with them to try and reunite them with their children and rediscover that sense of childlike wonder and imagination. I think just hearing that synopsis, you can go, that kind of sounds like a Pixar film. You can see elements of Monsters Inc. or Toy Story or even Inside Out, but I think there's a number of ways that it doesn't quite work. Everyone talks about how Pixar films make them cry, like when Woody had to give up Andy, or just the pure emotional devastation that is the opening of Up. One of Pixar's big skills was getting people incredibly emotionally invested, and ultimately that's what movies are about, getting an emotional experience, whether that's excitement or laughter or even tears. So when Krasinski comes to make his live-action Pixar film, that emotional heft is something he clearly wants to incorporate, and the way he does that is by including a lot of tragedy. The movie features one parent that's already dead, and then another that looks like they're on their way out, and obviously that's really sad, but just because you know that's sad, that doesn't mean that the movie itself is emotional. When you look at the married life sequence of Up, which is brilliant on its own, but what really tips that sequence over the edge, I think, is everything that comes before it with Carl and Ellie as kids.
My name's Ellie.
We get a sense of her character, how she's extroverted and outgoing, and when that character passes away, we feel that loss more because we've spent a bit of time with her. And again in Toy Story 3, when Woody has to let Andy move on, we feel that because we've spent so much time with Woody talking about Andy and how much he means to him, even though Andy is a relatively small character in the films. For If, the film tells us that Bee's mother passes away, but we don't really spend any time with her as a character. So even though I know this is going to be pretty emotionally devastating for Bee, the film doesn't make me feel anything. And the same is true for her dad. The big thing hanging over her is the fact that she's already lost one parent, and now there's the threat of losing another one. But John Krasinski is really not in the film that much. He appears in like 30-second intervals. So you really don't feel his presence very much throughout the film. So whenever there's moments, whenever the music swells and the acting gets really dramatic, the emotional moment of it just doesn't land because you don't have that connection. So it feels like the film is trying to skip the emotional investment by just making the tragedy that much higher, but without the investment in the characters, it doesn't work. See, part of why Pixar is able to get that emotion out of you is because they have great characters, and they give them compelling flaws. In Finding Nemo, Marlin is such an overbearing parent that he's basically smothering his son. Woody, who we think of as a really friendly character, is so insecure about his position as the favorite toy that he tries to kill Buzz. But even though they're flawed characters, we like them. In fact, that's why we like them. We want to see them make choices and we want to see them change. The big emotional moments are rooted in these character flaws. When Marlin spends the whole movie trying to get to Nemo and hold on to him, it's when he chooses to let him go that makes us emotional. When Buzz Lightyear spends the entire film insisting that he's not a toy, that he has a far greater purpose than just being played with, whenever he decides not to just go for the truck but to go for Andy, that's what makes the ending so strong. For Bee, at the start of If, she's decided that she doesn't want to be treated like a kid anymore. She's shut off her imagination and her sense of childhood, partly because she wants to be more grown up, but mostly because she doesn't want to get hurt again. And there is something really compelling about lost childhood, but apart from one scene where she tells her grandmother that she doesn't want to do art anymore, you never really get the sense that she's trying to suppress her imagination. Compare this to Buzz Lightyear in Toy Story. Think how much of that film he spends categorically denying he's a toy. Or Marlin, whose journey takes him across all the dangers of the sea that he's been trying to protect Nemo from. For both of those characters, whenever they're presented with an obstacle, their perspective is reinforced. Whenever Buzz Lightyear sees other toys, he insists that they're alien creatures. When Marlin sees all the dangers of the sea, it just proves that everything he was worried about was right. So whenever these characters do ultimately change, it's more emotional because we've seen all the reasons why they didn't want to, and now they understand and we understand why they have to. For If, the whole conceit of the movie is the fact that she's surrounded by imaginary friends, so pretty much immediately she buys into that idea of childlike wonder and sees that it has value. So it never really feels like she has any of the flaws that the film suggests she does because she doesn't really ever have to make that choice. The bigger emotional arc really is for Ryan Reynolds' character Cal. He runs a home for all the forgotten ifs, and he's grown really cynical about the idea of them ever reconnecting with their children. So the change for him to get back to that perspective of childlike wonder is more compelling because he's the one that's affected by it. He's the one that lives with the ifs that have been forgotten. He's personally affected by children outgrowing their ifs in a way that B isn't, but even though he has a slightly stronger arc, he's the side character, and so the film just spends so much less time on him. And then there's also the fact, and I say this as someone who likes Ryan Reynolds, he's just playing the same Ryan Reynolds character that he plays in everything, which just seems to be a slightly exaggerated version of himself. And so I really find it hard to connect with him because it doesn't feel like a unique character. It just feels like Ryan Reynolds. And then there's all the side characters. There's a ton of ifs played by a whole host of famous actors, but it feels like they're just there for you to go, oh look, it's that famous actor. It's fascinating comparing this to Toy Story, who also has a whole bunch of famous actors playing characters, but even though they also have distinct voices that you recognize, they still feel like they're playing unique characters, and they all play characters that feel like they have a purpose in the story. Rex, Bo Peep, Mr. Potato Head, they all have a relationship with Woody. They make him feel important and in charge whenever they go to him for help, and they make him feel insecure whenever they're all amazed at Buzz. And ultimately, even in their small roles, they're flawed characters who make choices, and there's a mean side to them. At the end, they choose to throw Woody out of the truck. They both drive the story forward, and they have dimension in their own right. In If, outside Steve Carell and Phoebe Waller-Bridge, all the other ifs just feel like they're voice cameos. And so when the film tries to lean on these characters for some sort of emotional impact, it doesn't work because they're not particularly memorable and because they don't go through any interesting change. And that's a big problem whenever this film is trying to go so heavy with the emotion. You think that maybe the fact that this film is live action would mean that you'd have more of a connection to the characters and their seemingly real tragedy, but I actually think that ends up working against the film. See, one of the things that makes Pixar Pixar is the fact that they choose stories that are enhanced by animation. Until relatively recently, there would have been any other way to make a whole film about an underground ant colony, or a whole film about fishes, or a movie about a rat that controls a chef by pulling on his hair. Even something like Toy Story, where you could technically do a live action version of it, it wouldn't work the same way. Imagine a live action version of this sequence. It would be horrifying.
We toys can see everything.
The unreality of animation allows you to get away with so much more. And that's where If has this weird problem, because the film is about imaginary friends, and obviously in the real world, children's imaginary friends are in the real world with them. So it kind of makes sense why they would want to do it live action. But the types of imaginary friends children can have are limitless, so the film tries to cater to that by showing a whole bunch of different characters. Everything from a big furry purple creature, to a glass with an ice cube in it, to whatever the hell this is supposed to be. It kind of makes sense. But visually, it's an absolute mess. There's no cohesion between any of these characters, so whenever they're occupying the same space, it looks really weird. It's part of why the poster just looks so terrible. Compare that to something like the Spider-Verse films, which has to blend all these different characters and different art styles, and it works together perfectly. You really get a sense of all the individual art styles and the creativity behind each character, and it looks beautiful. Trying to blend so many different elements in live action is so much harder. But even if all the characters did look great, they're still limited by the practical reality of where they can film and the limits on their VFX budget. I really don't feel that the film even fully explores the full potential of imaginary friends as a concept. An animated Pixar film wouldn't have been constrained by any sort of reality and could go anywhere with it. Because when it comes to talking about Pixar and trying to make something like a Pixar film, it's impossible to disconnect the animation part from it. It's not about just having animated characters or animation being a tool, it's the fact that animation is a medium that can be used to tell different stories, that can tell stories that only can be told in animation. So doing it in live action means you're never going to be able to go to the places that Pixar can go. I really wanted to love this film, especially because it's an original movie, and especially because even Pixar themselves aren't going to be making as many original movies anymore. But I don't think this film hits any of the highs that Pixar films do, and I think it was a mistake for them to be talking so much about Pixar when promoting this film. But that's just my thoughts on the film. Let me know what you thought in the comments. Have I been too harsh? Is this going to be a children's classic in 20 years? Let me know. And if you want to see more stuff, subscribe.